Yeah, well, first of all, like Ethereum doesn't actually functionally have a mempool. Like if you try to build a block on Ethereum with only mempool transactions, you will have 1/10 of the rewards. If you'll have a block that is 1/10 of the size, you'll have a block that is 1/10 or worse of the rewards as somebody who uses PBS. So functionally, Ethereum does not have a mempool either, or like nobody uses the mempool.
To be clear, when you're talking about rewards there, you're excluding the seniorage rewards.
I'm saying for the block, the transactions on the block, like.
Yeah.
You can literally look at the Etherscan and look at the blocks that are not PBS blocks, and they're 10% full, and they actually mess with the base fee, which is an interesting thing to see. But like I would say, almost all transactions now are going through the builders through PBS on Ethereum,
right.
And here a lot of transactions get sent directly to the leader.
Okay, so today we have with us Max Resnick, who is the chief economist at Anza. Before that, he was a researcher at Consensus. And I met Max 2 years ago when I had just started crypto at my first research conference, which was SBC. And it was actually at a side event that happened, so it was not at the main conference, but a side event. And Max gave a talk. I can't remember what it was actually. Maybe it was about auctions, I think. But it was the first talk that I understood, because it was like finally someone presented some idea with a clear mathematical framework and showed, just using really simple mathematical analyses, how to interpret what was going on. And I was like, oh, finally I can understand someone in this space. And since then, I've been always looking forward to see the things Max writes and puts out, and when he gives presentations, and he's continued to impress the same way. So very happy to have Max with us today, and hopefully he can do the same thing that he's continued to do, so that everyone can understand some of the differences between Solana and Ethereum that we'll get into today, but with no math.
No math. Yeah, this is a lot of pressure on me, but I think it is interesting because there's like a lot of research in crypto fails in one of two ways. First way of failing is that it doesn't address the actual problem that matters in the chain. Like it's like an imaginary problem or a problem that doesn't exist. And the second way is that it's not rigorous enough in its analysis. So it doesn't actually add anything. It just adds noise. And like these two types of things are very common. And so my goal, and I don't always succeed with it, but anytime I'm doing research, it's like, first of all, is this a real problem? Yes. And then second, it's like, take it to the point where it is rigorous enough to be useful. And then sometimes I've been criticized for stopping doing the math after I've made my point. And so that's what I'm working on now, is continue to do the math so that it gets into the conference after I've made the point.
I guess I can even ask you more questions with just that, but I'm curious if we should, Fahad, if we think we should jump into the Ethereum Solana debate. But my question would be like, why do you think crypto has those problems? But yeah.
Why does crypto have this problem? Yeah. Mostly, I would say there just aren't that many people who actually know what's going on. And then that group of people doesn't intersect very much with the type of people who can do rigorous formal analysis. And so the kind of intersection of the group of people who like actually trade on chain, which is like maybe 100 people in total, but they're responsible for 50% of all on-chain transactions. And, these are the real users of the chain, the MEV people who like actually send transactions. And then they have a little bit of like a disdain for academics, so you kind of have to get past that if you want to really get some alpha out of them. They also don't want to share their alpha because that's how they make money. So you got to get them a little bit drunk if you want to get anything useful out of them. But I think those, for me at least, where I work in MEV, it's like those people are the people who really know what's going on. And they know all the interesting problems, but they don't necessarily have the tools or even the time to tackle them in a formal way. And so, like, I would say it's mostly a disconnect between either the engineers who are working on the thing and the researchers, or the traders who are trading in the game and the researchers. And when you bring that together, you can solve the issue.
So actually, if I can ask a follow-up question here, I mean, despite being an academic, I sympathize very much with the mindset of the engineers that you just described, because there is a lot of stuff in academia that maybe misses the important points and sort of studies an invented problem that it really has no application to anything, despite what the introduction claims. But I think on the flip side, I think a lot of times that people in industry disregard good work in academia, which again is a subset, maybe a small subset of the work in academia. But sometimes I think why they might disregard it is because it's not clear why it's immediately practical, or it's not clear that it is practically relevant, but not necessarily because it's not, but rather because past is not prologue, right? So for instance, there's like a lot of good academic work essentially on like the tail of distribution outcomes, right? And sometimes academics are making points about risks that have not yet been seen in the data, but it's just a matter of time before it starts to happen. And maybe sort of like maybe putting it more in a direct, practical way. Just because things seem to be going well right now doesn't mean that, separate from it blowing up, it doesn't mean that the trajectory is going to persist, and it doesn't mean that the system is set up in such a way that it will facilitate persistent growth, let's say. And so I guess I wonder whether you have any advice to academics in terms of how they position their work to practitioners, and also to that end, particularly when it is something that the idea is that the system may well be doing well now and it makes sense, but it's not really built to, for instance, scale or to survive in the long run. What's the best way for academics to actually sort of put that in a useful way for practitioners to consume?
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult problem, and I don't think that I fully have the answer, because actually a lot of my work is kind of like, hey, this bad thing is going to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. And then the common response from the engineer, which is very reasonable, is where is it? And I think the best way to get around it, for me, like my work very like auction theory, game theory heavy, and so like oftentimes I'll come across this thing where it's like, this is the game, solve the game out in the equilibrium, very bad equilibrium. And it's not a bad equilibrium yet, we're not there yet, but you're like slowly slipping there, and the argument is like, hey, we're going to slip and slip and slip, and we're going to get to the equilibrium, maybe like a kind of trembling hand style of argument. And so what I've been doing is basically showing the slipping. So I will talk a little bit later, but just as an example, right now there's these revenue schedulers going on Solana. People are kind of finally figuring out that their 1.6 second leader monopoly is valuable, and they're figuring out some ways to do better in terms of their rewards. So I first show, hey, like the revenue schedulers are proliferating. Here's some data. I show it basically in a chart I have this whole like mosaic of all of the slots and when stuff was scheduled. And the revenue schedulers are characteristic of, they schedule all the Jito transactions first, and then they like schedule everything else after. So it's like this kink. And I color all the ones that have the kink behavior red and the other ones are green. So then you can see the entire mosaic. You can see like 48 slots. I'll send it to you maybe if you want to put it up when you edit the video. And then you can see, hey, revenue schedule is proliferating. It's like 10% of the network now, and 3 months ago it was 0% of the network. And then you say, the step beyond that is, okay, is that actually bad? And you plot the markouts during the revenue scheduler slots, and they're like slightly worse. And then you hope that from there you can say, okay, induct on this for the next 5 years, and then you hope that you can do that last step. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you might need another step before they're ready to follow you along. But yeah,
I see. Okay, I think one way to say, I think what you're saying in a more academic way is, I think you're saying provide intermediate predictions that will already have realized, right? Like maybe the cataclysmic thing that is the whole sort of motivation for doing it hasn't realized, but there probably are things that should be happening near term, already have happened, that are consistent with the sort of the broader theory that you can show out. And apparently you can even color code if you want to make it sufficiently digestible to your audience.
Yeah, the at least for the Solana engineers, they love like pictures. They love soul scan links, which is like the actual transaction on chain,
Right.
and that's one way to kind of cut through the noise.
Okay. But okay, so actually then, uh, I'm thinking, why don't we start by addressing maybe kind of like the first part of the problem that you were describing, which is, us egghead academics, we don't always know kind of what's actually going on. So sometimes we study invented problems. And the advantage then of having somebody like you here is that you can tell us what is actually going on. And so, Brad and I kind of said before we started talking here that we're very much from the Ethereum mindset of things because I think everybody that's kind of the gateway to, let's say, the smart contract blockchain ecosystem. And so we were hoping that we could start the conversation by sort of going from sort of the Ethereum framework of thinking about blockchain in general to sort of understanding Solana as that using Ethereum as a point of departure. And really, I like to think about it in like two groups, which are pretty big groups. One is execution, the other is consensus. And I was hoping we could start at execution. And so, I think people are familiar with the sort of Ethereum construct of, okay, there's externally owned accounts, which are just basically regular user accounts, as we might see in something like even Bitcoin. But then Ethereum adds smart contract accounts. And these are sort of computer programs that are deployed on chain. They have functions, they have variables, so they have states, and they're basically just a bunch of code. How does Solana differ from that, if at all?
Yeah. So on the execution side, I guess I'm still like a little bit like bilingual, although I'm converting to using Solana language. But there's kind of a bunch of terms that you're probably familiar with from Ethereum, like the state root. That's the root of the Merkle tree of the state, and it's kind of a digest of all the state at the end of the block. So we have something similar. It's not exactly a Merkle root. You can't prove inclusion, but it's called the bank hash. And that's basically the digest. It's a lattice hash of all the state. And every block, we compute the bank hash and we have consensus on it inside of our votes. So from like starting from a very high level view, we have our own version of a execution digest, which we call the bank hash, which it corresponds in some ways to the Ethereum state root. The biggest differences, I would say, in the way that we do execution broadly in Solana is that our execution is pipelined. So on Ethereum, you make a one big block, you send it out to everybody, they execute the block, and then they do consensus. So it's kind of one thing happens after the other, right? And on Solana, you start making your block at the beginning of your slot, start sending out transactions. Over the entire 400 millisecond slot, you're sending out transactions. Now, maybe I'm sending to both of you. When Brad receives the first shred, the first pieces of data from my block, he starts to execute them immediately. And so by the time he's received the full block, he's hopefully almost all the way done with executing the block because he's received 90% of it already and he's already executed it.
But so can I just interject? So how do we think about like the case where, so you send those shreds out to both me and Brad, but other people are sending us shreds too, and the shreds we receive are in different orders because we're at different places in the network, and maybe there's like state interactions, right? So I don't know. Let's say I'm going to give an Ethereum example. I don't know if it makes sense in Solana. It probably does in some way, but if you excuse me with this, so there's a smart contract that has a balance in there, and there are two users that can both draw from it. And so you're one of the users, and I don't know, your friend Bob is one of the users, and both of you are sending transactions simultaneously for the full amount inside the thing. Brad sees your transaction first. I see Bob's transaction first. If we're just running these things in sequence, shouldn't I basically think that your transaction isn't valid and Brad should think that Bob's transaction isn't valid because you're drawing on the same account? And it's fine that you are because of the access controls allowing for that. But the order matters, I guess, is what I'm saying. And so how do we deal with the order mattering if we're sort of executing the shreds in sequence before we know that this is like the correct, this is the fully formed block?
Yeah, so similar to Ethereum, there's a single leader right now, and that single leader produces the entire block, and so they know the state that they're executing on top of.
Okay, I see. Okay,
And
so you're not talking about users sending out shreds. Oh, I see. Okay, so it's only the equivalent of the block proposer that is sending out this content.
yeah, I mean, Ethereum has this idea of a mempool. We don't have the mempool. You just send your transaction directly to the leader. The
Oh,
leader executes and sends that out to the rest of the network who vote on it. So
okay. I
it's
see.
pretty
Oh, wait. So it's,
similar.
yeah, yeah.
Yep.
Sure. But okay. So I think the step that I was missing is that when you were describing the shreds being sent out, I was thinking of it as like users sending transactions, and what you're saying is, no. Users send it to this sort of central point for the moment because it's just the leader at this point in time, and then
Mhm.
the leader is the one who's sending out shreds. But so does the leader have the entire block, or is it like the leader is getting transactions from users and is then sequentially also sending them out? I'm not sure that matters, but just for my conceptual understanding.
Yeah, the leader is scheduling for their entire slot, and so they may receive a transaction while they're scheduling. They may have already sent out a bunch of transactions. Now
I
they
see.
receive a new transaction, and they still include it. As I get to the end of my slot, I sign the whole thing. I finish it up, and then I sign it, and
I
then
see.
we vote on that last thing, which is like the whole block. We vote on the block as a whole with the leader signature on it.
So does the leader have any ordering in there, like, or is it just like first come first serve, or is it
Yeah,
within the thread?
so there's two things here. There, the crude ordering is that every block has a index for every transaction. So they're just a linearized ordering of the transactions. That tells you which is before which other transaction. There's another thing which we call proof of history ticks, and those are as I'm scheduling transactions, I'm doing this hashing operation on the what's called the block ID at the time, or like I'm basically doing some cryptographic timer as I insert transactions into the block, and that's proof of history. And so we also can see basically how many hashes through the block were you when you sequence the transaction. Although that's not available in a typical block explorer, so I actually had to do a bunch of work to get it, but that is available if you have the raw history of the blockchain.
So, I okay, I'm in my mind, I'm comparing this to what Ethereum does, and it at a very high level, it sounds in some sense more appealing than the way Ethereum is structured, owing partially to the problem that I was sort of alluding to earlier when the users are sending it into a mempool. But kind of if you could like maybe steelman the other side of that argument and say like, okay, so or maybe both sides of the argument. So like, what are the trade-offs of this design that you're describing relative to Ethereum's design?
Yeah, well, first of all, like Ethereum doesn't actually functionally have a mempool. Like if you try to build a block on Ethereum with only mempool transactions, you will have 1/10 of the rewards of you'll have a block that is 1/10 of the size. You'll have a block that is 1/10 or worse of the rewards as somebody who uses PBS. So functionally, Ethereum does not have a mempool either, or like nobody uses the
But to
mempool
be
on
clear, when
Ethereum.
you're talking about rewards there, you're excluding the like the seniorage rewards.
Yeah, I'm saying for the block, the
Yeah.
transactions on the block, like
Yeah.
you can literally
The priority fee.
look at the Etherscan and look at the blocks that are not PBS blocks, and they're
Yep.
10% full, and they actually mess with the base fee, which is an interesting thing to see. But like I would say, almost all transactions now are going through the builders through PBS on Ethereum,
Right.
and here a lot of transactions get sent directly to the leader.
But even
Uh,
that is different, right? Like having it sent to a private mempool and having different builders competing, even if there are very few builders, is I would say conceptually different than saying, look, we've elected a proposer in this slot. So I'm using Ethereum language sort of purposely because my point is
mhm.
that in effect, like Ethereum could just say, look, we have elected a proposer. Everybody knows who the proposer is. Send the proposer your transactions and only the proposer your transactions.
Yeah, I'm not sure their node software would be able to handle the DOS, but yeah, definitely they could do that.
Ethereum won't be able to handle it.
If you, yeah, well, it's just a lot of traffic when you do that. Like, you have your like IP exposed, and like everybody wants to land, and then like it gets congested, and now like you start dropping packets, so everybody like wants to land even more, and so they send more and more packets, and you keep dropping more and more randomly, and then yeah, I mean this is not a theoretical thing. This has happened certainly in the past on Solana.
So what is the distinction in the context of Solana? Because if I understood correctly, you're saying everybody is sending it to the leader in your case. Is it the network being smaller, or like what's the difference?
I think...
In other words, why can Solana handle it, but you're saying Ethereum wouldn't be able to?
Well, we've written a lot better code, I would say, because we needed to.
Okay.
So there's like some narrative that this is because the validators are more beefy nodes. And that's certainly true because if you have 100,000 transactions, you need to verify the signature. There's just like, that is just something you need to like churn through. But a lot of the thing that kind of the research community misses is that you can just kind of sit there with a flame graph with a profiler, and you can just knock off tons and tons of work and latency and get it to a point where it's way, way, way faster than the initial implementation. And so like even Solana, when it first started this approach, just couldn't handle the traffic. And, now we can handle, hundreds of thousands of transactions ingress, verify the signature, verify the fee payer, verify everything we need to verify, which is, a lot of work. It's like 16 different steps that we need to verify for every transaction. Sig verify and fee payer and nonce. These are kind of the most expensive ones in there. And all that can happen on hundreds of thousands of transactions on the average Solana node. And it's not only because the nodes are beefier with more cores and more networking. It's actually a lot about writing better software so that you can ingest the packets and do the work and distribute it among the cores in the right way. And so it's I think a lot of it's like, just, the Ethereum nodes are like too slow and small and they're Raspberry Pis, but you can do a lot with a Raspberry Pi if you really know what you're doing. If you know how to like do kernel bypass, you can do a lot with a Raspberry Pi too. It just happens that they're not doing that.
There's one thing I wanted to... Well, there's more threads to go along this, but I just wanted to rewind for a second to go about the public mempool discussion. I guess... one thing that comes to mind, if you say Solana has no public mempool, then can you still be front run and sandwiched on like trading activity? Because typically that's how you get front run in Ethereum, right? You put your thing in a public mempool.
Yeah, and if you look at the data on Ethereum, by the way, that many, many more people are sending to the builders directly.
Yeah.
And the sandwiching is going way down, and we did that with MetaMask transactions at consensus, and the sandwiching obviously went way down after we did that because it was no longer revealed to Jared from Subway looking in the mempool.
He still gets stuff though. But yeah.
But it's I mean it's like we plotted it, like it's just like
it's reduced. Okay.
It's basically zero, and you still have like the bloom filter and stuff. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. But yeah. There is still a way though. If the leader wants to sandwich you, then the leader sees your transaction and they can obviously do whatever they want with it.
And you can't protect against that.
Well, you can not send to them. But I also think sandwiching is like this kind of... It's like a... What's the word that I'm looking for? It's something that a lot of people like to think about, and it's actually not a problem because it's an application level problem.
Mm-hmm.
Like Uniswap v2 made it so that you instantly refill the liquidity as soon as the take happens. That is what allows the front running and sandwiching to happen. if you remove just that little part where you instantly refill and like you kind of wait for the next block, or you do something different than that, then you get rid of the problem almost entirely. And we now have a situation on Solana where these prop AMMs don't refill because you like it's stupid to refill. Like from a P&L standpoint, you don't want to refill. And for that reason, the sandwiching activity is way, way, way down.
So could you clarify what exactly you mean here by refill? Like, are we talking about two-way liquidity?
Yeah. So it's an order type where as soon as you hit it from one side, it refills directly on the other
Right,
side.
right.
Like in
And
contrast to the order book where it's just gone. That's
yeah.
like the standard.
Or
Okay.
it's gone and maybe you refill it in the next
And the
slot
next
or
block,
something like
right?
that. Yeah. That's like the difference, I would say.
Right. Okay, so I think actually we've been talking quite a bit also on consensus so far, and so I'd like to because you also mentioned proof of history, and I was tempted to go into that, but then it occurred to me that I believe, and please correct me if I'm wrong, proof of history is not going to be part of the new protocol, right? Alpenglow, and so I was wondering whether we could talk about the motivation for changing the protocol. And then maybe we could also go into talking about what the new protocol, what Alpenglow actually is.
Do you want to, before we get into that, do you want to talk about a few more things on the execution side? So one of them is parallel
Well,
execution,
well,
and
I
then
was
the
thinking
other.
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think just as long as we get to them, I think parallel execution is super big difference, and then that kind of account structure is also maybe something we should touch on.
So I definitely want to touch on those, particularly the account structure. But I was thinking we could come back to it
Yeah.
since we've already sort of touched on some of the things like proof of history and so on, and
Yeah.
shreds. um, but so yeah, so then could you just clarify the thinking behind changing the protocol?
Um, I think we want to make the protocol better. I guess is the
But what's it
idea.
lacking about? What is lacking about the current protocol?
It's just extremely complex, and it's so complex that it's hard to have like a concrete security proof of it. And so like we want um, we want a protocol that's provably secure, is simpler, is faster, is gonna be much easier to modify in case we want to do more complicated stuff like multi-leader or even faster leader handover and all kinds of stuff like this. And so, we have Tower. I would say proof of history um, is often thought about as part of the consensus architecture, but I really don't think that it is a core part in that you could remove it from Tower and it wouldn't really change too much about how the thing works. It's kind of more of like you could remove it from Tower, replace it with timeouts in Tower, and then not have too many issues.
What's a
So it's
timeout?
just like the way a normal protocol works is you didn't receive the block before a timeout, and then you say I didn't receive the block before the timeout, or you like don't vote on it, depending on the protocol. And I guess like proof of history, I don't know the exact details of why it's in there, but like the in some ways it was meant to replace the timeout as a system clock. Like if you wanted to, you could kind of like start churning through proof of history ticks, and then the fact that you churned through a bunch of proof of history ticks meant that you like didn't see the block in time was basically
Right.
the idea.
But so I guess with the timeout thing, I didn't quite understand how it resolves the fact that we may not have synchronized clocks. Like I
Oh,
get
it
that, yeah, yeah.
it you use the timeout to decide when to vote on something, and then if everybody votes yes, then it arrived before the timeout and sufficiently many nodes, and so it goes in that slot.
But if I can have arbitrary delays, let's say to messages and so on, then how would I even know what all the votes are with certainty?
You don't necessarily. Maybe it's useful to describe like the
Yeah.
simplex protocol, which is kind of like a simpler version of Alpenglow. But basically, the way it works is somebody proposes a block. They send that block out to everyone.
Yeah.
Everyone has a timer before which they're supposed to have received the block and made sure it was valid.
But those timers are not assumed to be
Local timer,
synchronized, right?
local
Yeah.
clock.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, local clock. And I set it when I received the previous certificate from the previous round finishing, basically.
Right. Which will
So
be
it's a
off there
completely
for a little bit.
local.
For everybody will be off by a little bit. Okay.
Yeah, everybody can be off by a little bit, but this certificate formation kind of brings it back together
Okay.
because it has to have a bunch of votes from a bunch of people. Anyway, everybody has their local clock and can be off. Anyway, you you send your block out. If it arrives and we make sure it's valid, then we vote to notarize the block. Okay, so that's the first round. So we send out all our notarization votes to everybody. And if I receive sufficiently many, 2/3 or more notarization votes before a second timeout, then I vote to finalize. And once I see sufficiently many finalized votes, that's a final block.
Right. Okay. So I guess the part that I'm still struggling with is that so, for instance, you're talking about a voting threshold, and the voting threshold, like knowing the voting threshold has been reached, is based on a local clock. And so part of what I'm wondering is like there must be some security assumptions underlying it, and also for instance like there must be some assumptions about the level of synchronicity of the network. Meaning, I'm not saying you're assuming everything is perfectly synchronous, but probably also not fully asynchronous. And so, what exactly is the sort of network assumptions under which this makes sense?
Yeah, so for the simplex protocol, which is like maybe a simplified version of Alpenglow,
Yeah.
you have a few assumptions. You have a networking assumption, which is that this is a partially synchronous network. So there's three kinds of network assumptions. There's synchrony, which is that every message arrives in a finite time that we call delta. There's partial synchrony, which says eventually, after some time we call global stabilization time,
Yeah.
we enter a period of synchrony. So then eventually after GST, everything arrives within delta.
Yep.
And then there's asynchrony, which is just everything arrives eventually. So it's everything arrives in finite time. Eventually everything arrives in finite time. Everything arrives eventually is the way I think about it. And we're in that middle period where it's like most of the time the network is in the synchronous world where everything's working fine and we can get our packets from Tokyo to New York in less than 100 milliseconds. But then sometimes something happens, who knows what it is, a switch gets overloaded, a undersea cable gets cut, and we enter a period of asynchrony where messages can be delayed arbitrarily long by the adversary. And then after some amount of time, we come back to a period of synchrony. And so the properties that we want are as long as no more than F of the network is Byzantine, we have safety and liveness under partial synchrony. And Simplex satisfies that with the 1/3 adversary model. And in Alpenglow, we actually have a 1/5 adversary, 1/5 Byzantine plus 1/5 crash model. So crash means they just go offline. And it's also secure under partial synchrony with that different security assumption.
Max, I have a super basic clarification question. You're using the term secure often, and I just want you to like make that a little more concrete. Like what exactly does security mean in this aspect? Like how is the protocol becoming more secure? And you can also contrast this to Ethereum if that would be useful for me. Yeah.
In a consensus sense?
Yeah.
So typically security
Go ahead.
is in a consensus sense, like you're formally safe and live. And actually Ethereum's LMD Ghost has had a lot of problems and is kind of in a similar world. It's a similar family of protocols to what we have in Tower, in that it's a path dependent follow on to Nakamoto consensus, which is Bitcoin consensus. And so it's like, hey, Bitcoin consensus is cool. How do we turn that into a proof of stake concept. And so they said, let's do greedy heaviest observed subtree, which is their version of longest chain. Okay, so then they had greedy heaviest observed subtree, and then some people, including Joachim, who I work with closely now on some of the MCP work that we're doing, and Nusrat, and some of David Say's students, and some of the people at EF, they kind of said, oh, that doesn't quite work out, because there's this thing you can do where you can balance the two forks, and you can keep that going forever if you're a good enough adversary.
Is this the bouncing attack?
Yeah. There's this paper, like two more attacks. Some attacks on Ethereum proof of stake, then there's like two more attacks, and then there's three more attacks. You can go read the entire history. And what happened is every time they found a new attack, usually balancing attack related, they would go and make a patch to it. Yeah. Similar thing happened in Solana. You would find a issue with Tower, put in a patch. Now it's fixed against that patch. Maybe your patch introduced something else. Who knows? And that's what happened to Ethereum. It's also what happened to Tower. And eventually, the authors of all these kind of Ethereum papers came up with something called Goldfish, which was a way to prevent the balancing attacks, where you kind of wait to change your view with all the new votes you've received. And that paper is almost similar to Alpenglow in that it's like the Goldfish protocol was a way to start from zero and say, this is a protocol that achieves everything Ethereum wanted to achieve with their consensus, but is provably safe and live from the beginning, not like we think it works. And the same is true for Alpenglow. It's like, this is kind of in the spirit of what we're trying to do with Tower and what we're trying to do with pipelined execution and everything, but it's provably safe and live from the start. And it also has advantage that's faster. So that's kind of the way I think about it, is like, you kind of don't want to start with something that you don't know whether or not it works. Find patch after patch after patch after patch. Eventually it's so complicated you don't even know whether it works or not. You kind of want to start with something really simple and that works, and not have to patch it over and over and over again.
So first, I just want to ask a clarification question here. So it sounds like you're saying that for the current protocol that Ethereum uses, I mean, you were referring to Ghost, but even presumably then when you fuse it together with the finality gadget and you have Gasper, the statement I'm about to make will still hold. So I want to clarify that this is what you're saying. I think you're saying that Gasper, there was no formal demonstration of safety and liveness for Gasper under whatever security, whatever synchronicity assumptions you would like. But the point is, there was no formal paper establishing safety and liveness, again, under whatever conditions. But there were papers that came about that essentially pointed out that safety or liveness might be violated. And then there was kind of this ad hoc thing about like, okay, fine, so let's put this patch in so that that particular argument no longer holds, but we won't actually necessarily then prove that the resulting protocol does achieve safety and liveness. It's just that those particular attacks no longer induce safety or liveness faults. And this eventually led to that Goldfish paper, but presumably Goldfish is different than Gasper. And you're saying the approach with Alpenglow is that, no. So now we do have a formal result about establishing security under the 20+20 you were describing. And so essentially it's like, in some sense, it's a more academic approach, I would say, and less of an ad hoc approach. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's definitely not what we're used to in Solana, I would say. Yeah, but it is that. It's kind of, we have the same thing. Just to be clear, I'm not saying that this is a uniquely Ethereum problem. We had a protocol that, Vitalik cooked up LMD Ghost. LMD, is latest message driven. It was a way to protect against the balancing attacks where you give some bonus to the recently proposed block to try and make it harder. Anyway, and also Ghost is the live part of the ledger. And so a lot of the things that were wrong with the liveness area. And that's the same for Solana as well. Oftentimes, the safety is kind of easier to guarantee than the liveness. And
you don't accept any blocks?
Yeah, just never accept any blocks. You have a safe ledger, right? But you have to start adding stuff, and you want to make sure you don't rip anything out, and that's what safety
Right.
is. And then the liveness thing. So you have two things in LMD: Ghost, Gasper. Gasper is the finality gadget,
Casper.
and
So
yeah,
Gasper's the fusion. Casper's the finality
Gasper is the
gadget.
fusion. Casper is the
Yeah.
friendly. Yeah. Anyway, and then it's a ghost. Anyway, it's very
Friendly
cute,
finality
very
gadget.
cute.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Very cute naming scheme. Anyway, so I think most of the things that were broken were with Ghost and
Okay.
not with Gasper, from my understanding. And then similarly for us, like the patches that went in were related to liveness and mostly not to safety.
So I would just want to introduce a little bit of language here to help sort of maybe understand what's going on. So I've heard Alpenglow is described as having two component parts, one being a voter, which I think is what you were describing earlier. But then there's this other component, I believe, called a rotor, which has been described, I've heard, as like the data dissemination piece. And this gets into something you alluded to very early on in this conversation, shreds. So could you maybe just describe the data dissemination protocol, rotor?
Yeah, so rotor is actually more similar to what we currently have with Turbine than voter is to Tower. So rotor is a way for me to get my block from my validator box that I'm proposing the block on to everybody else. And maybe it's useful to think about what happens in Ethereum with ETH P2P. I select 8 of my peers in the gossip network, and I broadcast the entire block to all 8 of those peers. So whatever block size I have, I've now multiplied that by 8, and that's my egress bandwidth. Each of those guys selects 8 of their peers, and they send it to them. And you keep doing that until you hit all 4,000 or so nodes in the Ethereum gossip network. And so you can imagine this takes like log base 8 of 4,000. So to reach everybody, I think the latest stats from Marianne, who's a professor at MIT who works on this kind of data dissemination protocol side, she has a kind of tweet that she put out that said it's about 1 second for Ethereum to gossip one Ethereum block, which is much smaller than the Solana block, to the entire network. And Solana, we do it a different way. So instead of selecting 8 peers and sending them each the entire block, we, for each shred set, which is kind of a subset of the block, you may have heard it called slice. It used to be called a forward error correcting set. It's basically 32 packets worth of data, so about 32 kilobytes of transaction data, and then another 32 kilobytes of erasure coding. Okay? You compute 64 shreds, 32 of which are data, 32 of which are kind of redundancy for the error correction, the erasure correction. And you send one of those shreds each to 64 what we call relays. And those relays send it to everybody else. And so as soon as you've heard half of the shreds from any of the relays, you can reconstruct the block. And for us, we have about 1,000 nodes right now, and it takes maybe 150 milliseconds to broadcast our much larger blocks to the entire network. And the egress bandwidth is only 2x the block size relative to 8x the block size on Ethereum. So it's just kind of like a much better way to broadcast the block. Ethereum should do it for sure.
So yeah, so there are a couple of things I want to pick up on there. So first, just to clarify, like in this case, is the block already formed before the shreds are sent out?
Each block is divided up into multiple slices.
Right. No. But what I'm saying is, you already said block, right? So like in the earlier, when we were talking about the current protocol, you were describing it as though like the block doesn't need to be formed yet, and shreds can start to be sent out. Whereas here you were talking about blocks being decomposed into shreds and slices. So I'm wondering, in this case, is a fully formed block first formed by the leader, and Okay.
No. Basically, I start packing the block, and I
Yeah.
make 32 kilobytes worth of data,
Okay.
and then I send out a shred set with that data. And then
I
I
see.
pack the next 32 kilobytes of data, and I send the shreds out with that data, and so on until I've packed the entire block.
Okay. So another question, the relays. Could you say a bit more? Like, so partially, I'm also kind of wondering about incentives here. I mean, we haven't talked about incentives for the leader, but I presume the incentives are not materially different than they are in, for instance, Ethereum or even Bitcoin, in the sense that presumably there's some sort of seigniorage reward in addition to some kind of transactions fees. And, please do correct that if that's wrong. But nonetheless, what is the, yeah, like, first, I guess, who are the relays? Like, is this a permissionless thing? And secondly, what incentivizes them to do what they do?
The relays are also validators, so
Okay.
similar to the way that we select the leader from among the validator set, we also select some relays from among the validator set, each slot, and they rotate. And you may select, you have 64 for each slice, and you may have many slices in a block, and so you may be rotating through multiple sets of relays within the same block.
And so presumably they're also rewarded through seigniorage rewards in the same way like testers are rewarded through seigniorage rewards in Ethereum.
No, they don't receive any rewards at all right now. Also,
Okay.
the leader does not receive any seigniorage based rewards right now, but he
Okay.
does receive 2,500 land ports for each vote he lands. And so even if there's no activity, there are votes, and so you still receive 2,500 land ports times 1,000 votes.
Okay, but so the one quick tangential question then. So presumably there is an increasing issuance of Sol. Who does that go to? Or I guess maybe there's not. So
It's based on the vote rewards, not the
uh,
rewards.
okay, okay. Okay, so then I'll go off that tangent and come back to something from what you just said earlier that I want to ask you about, which is erasure coding. So this is actually Ethereum relevant too, actually, right? But could you just say a little bit about what erasure coding is, and why it's useful?
Yeah. Let me see if I can do it in a way that Miriam would
An
approve of.
intuitive way?
So there's this problem that all of the coding computer science professors like to cite, which is this ticket collecting problem. I will use state quarters because that's what I like to collect when I was younger because I'm a zoomer and not a boomer. But apparently there was these cereal boxes and you would have a collection of, say, 64 tickets, and you would go buy a box of Cheerios every week and you would try to complete a collection of all 64 unique tickets in the Cheerios thing, and maybe if you collected them all, you could send them in and get some kind of prize. For me, it makes a lot more sense with state quarters, so I think they should update because now everybody in the class is going to understand the state quarters a lot better. But you're like looking through the quarter and you don't have Hawaii, and there's like only a 1 in 50 chance that the next quarter you look at is Hawaii. And the idea is that the first thing you get, you probably don't have any quarters yet, so there's no chance of a duplicate. The second one you draw, there's a 1 in 50 chance that it's the same state as the first one that you draw. And as you go on, it's harder and harder to find the last piece of data, or the last quarter in this case. And making a full collection is quite hard. And erasure coding is kind of a way to get around that. It's basically a way to say, no matter which pieces of data that you are missing, which pieces of data are erased, that's where the erasure code comes from, you can still reconstruct the underlying data. And so for us, we have 32 kilobytes of data that we want to send out to everybody. What we actually do is we kind of we do Reed-Solomon erasure coding, which is basically a polynomial erasure coding scheme. And similar in the way that if you know any 32 roots of a degree 32 polynomial, if you know
I mean,
any
32 points.
So I'm going to pick 64 points of the polynomial, and then I'm going to send you a bunch of those, and if up to 32 get lost, it's okay because you can still reconstruct the polynomial with those 32 points.
So it's like an overcomplete set of data. So it's okay to lose some. Is that
Right. But if we
okay?
critically, like one thing we could do is we could just take our data and duplicate it
Yeah.
and then send it out. But we still have the problem. Maybe like you lost the main quarter in both sets of data. And this makes it a lot harder. You basically have to lose all of the second copy and one of the first copy to not be able to reconstruct, rather than just lose kind of the same piece of data from both copies.
Maybe this is a good opportunity to go back to execution, actually, because I know that was something you wanted to get into, and I guess you touched on some things related to Solana nodes being a lot beefier, and I said, well, you alluded to the Raspberry Pi, Ethereum on a Raspberry Pi thing, and I think that's like a pretty interesting topic to get into, like, because you're trading off something. The fact that if Ethereum can run on a Raspberry Pi, then everybody can run an Ethereum node, and Solana machines nodes being beefier means that you can't do that. Um, that's my version of like the overview of what it is, but I know you have a much stronger take on this. So maybe I think it would be useful if you can describe the problem a little better than me, and your view on why, if you think Solana's approach is better.
Yeah, I think so. I used to be a really strong believer that one of the things holding back Ethereum was the hardware requirements were not high enough. I no longer believe that that is the case. I actually think you could take, I mean, Monad is a great example of this, and they're not live yet, but you look at their hardware requirements 32 gigabytes of RAM, kind of like Ryzen 7600X, which is a consumer CPU that you can go to Best Buy and buy. And, this is like all consumer hardware that anybody can run, 1 gigabyte upload download. Anybody you can get that in a lot of places in the world. This is like not prohibitive to run. I could run one of those from my desktop. In fact, my desktop that I bought 4 years ago is actually a lot more powerful than the spec that they provide in that. And they can do a lot more TPS than Ethereum can do because the design is way better.
Well,
The way Ethereum works is it's not designed well in that you're spending so little of the time on actually executing transactions and so much of the time waiting for things to happen. And in Solana, and also I think in a lot of the other modern protocols, the entire idea is let's do a bunch of things at the same time. Let's like try and cut out as much waiting as possible. So we're gonna build a block the whole time. We're gonna pipeline the execution so that we're also replaying the block while we're building it. We're gonna, with Alpenglow, we're gonna start voting on the blocks faster. These kinds of things like are the design philosophy of Solana. So that's on the protocol design side, and there's some things that it would be pretty easy for Ethereum to fix on the protocol side if they wanted to fix it and go in that direction. And then there's another thing, which is just the performance and the hardware acceleration side, which is how do you just write good software that, and I think we're nowhere near even the limits of writing good software at Solana right now. There's so much more you could do to make the thing faster that, even leaving the protocol the same, you could easily see another 25x in capacity, maybe even 100x in the capacity of Solana today, just by leaving the protocol completely as it is and then doing a bunch of incremental changes to make things faster and faster and faster.
So you're saying that neither of these like Solana or Monad, or, well, let's say live ones, Solana or Ethereum, haven't they haven't reached their maximum potential yet because there's so much low hanging fruit. And I guess what I was wondering is like, are there trade-offs in the design decisions? But you're saying like they haven't even written good software yet to reach the trade-offs. But are there any are there any trade-offs in the end?
Obviously there's some Pareto frontier of what you can do in a node. Like you cannot physically ingest more than the connection that you have. And so if the connection that you have is 100 megabyte per second connection, you cannot ingest more data than that per second. Okay. But what you're actually ingesting on Ethereum, or what you could actually do with that amount of data, your output egress for building a block is 8 times what it needs to be from a theoretical perspective, or maybe it's 4 times what it needs to be from a theoretical perspective. So if you fix that issue just by changing the block dissemination protocol, you've instantly unlocked 4 times bigger blocks from a bandwidth perspective. No change to the hardware requirement, no change to the upload or download capacity required. And the only change is kind of a change to the message dissemination protocol, which is like you kind of hope that it's going to be able to disseminate the block. But like this is the kind of thing that I think Ethereum gets so lost in the how do we do this like ZK scaling, because I give this analogy. Basically, you're running away from a bear and you see a cliff coming up in like 2 miles, and like you stop to make an airplane to go off the cliff and the bear mauls you. And that's, I think, what happened to Ethereum is like they said, oh no, we're going to get to this point where we can't scale on a Raspberry Pi. And way, way, way before they got to that point, they decided to get off the highway and start building a ZK airplane. And they're still building the ZK airplane, and they haven't moved at all. And the bear is like currently mauling them, which is either the competition has come and they've actually done the scaling work. And of course, we will eventually hit some fundamental bottleneck, which is we're ingesting 10 gigabytes per second on our 10 gigabyte per second ingest that we have. And like, there's no way of going beyond that. Okay. But we're so far away from that. Like, does it even make sense to think about it? Like, what, like if the actual bottleneck is, 1 million TPS or 10 million TPS on a single, like layer 1 blockchain, like, does it even make sense to go down this layer 2 ZK scaling road when you could in fact just like write better software and spend all the energy? It's way, way harder to make a ZK circuit go fast than it is to like fix the networking interface card to like directly bypass a bunch of stuff and like send it deeper into the machine faster. Like those two things are just so far different in terms of like what's actually required to do them, that I think it makes a lot more sense to focus on short-term gains, especially when we have no idea where the short-term gains will stop. And I guess I will say there's no end in sight of things that we could put in the linear tracker backlog that our engineers at Anza could be working on. And we have like 45 insanely cracked engineers, many of whom were former HFT engineers or were former big tech engineers. So they have a lot of formal training. They know what they're doing. And they've been working on this thing for 6 years, and there's still 5 years of at least of things we could write down for them to work on that would immediately have a tangible impact on the throughput of the system.
I guess
so. Given all that, if I can just quickly ask, like, how do you measure success? Like, for those of us who are just trying to keep track of what is relevant in the broader crypto ecosystem, I think there's sort of a path dependence kind of thing. Like when I was a PhD student in 2018, used to annoy the hell out of me. Everybody wanted to talk about Bitcoin in the economics community if they wanted to talk about crypto. I was like, who cares about Bitcoin? Let's talk about Ethereum. And it took years and years for academics to stop, at least for some of us, to stop centering on Bitcoin. But now I think it's there's the same path dependence with Ethereum, where I think they're doing a lot of important and interesting things. But I think there are also players in the space like Solana that are doing important and interesting things. But it's not clear from for those of us who are not already in the Solana community how to keep track of, let's say, how effective, let's say, Solana is being. Because the simplest thing is people look at the market value of the native asset and then they go like, oh, but Bitcoin's still first and Ether's still second. So could you give us like a metric to think about to sort of see the progress in the Solana community?
So the way I think about it is that infrastructure should basically be invisible to the users. So you should feel like...
How about the researchers?
They are
Like,
invisible already, so nothing to worry about.
yeah. Like
No,
that's my kind of metric is like, how can we make it so that anytime the user is thinking about the fact that they're like using the underlying protocol because it's slow, they can't land a transaction, they're paying fees that are too high, and it's prohibitive. These are all so the leader is censoring them and doing MEV on them. Like these are all things that, from a product perspective, we never want to have happen. And so the less and less the users who use the application think about the fact that they're using an application on a blockchain, I think the more and more successful we will become.
no, so I get that. So that's not what I meant. So when I meant like I didn't mean that users should be paying attention to researchers. I meant researchers should be aware of infrastructure. And so what I'm saying is for the research community, what are the metrics from which we can see the progress going on in Solana? And part of this is like coming up with the stylized facts that we would have to study to properly theoretically understand the distinctions between that ecosystem relative to the Ethereum ecosystem. And so, for instance, like, you mentioned things like, for instance, the fees associated with transactions, right? But of course, fees associated with transactions can be low because there's not a lot of load on the system to begin with. And I'm not saying that's the case with Solana. It's not the case with Solana, but there are lots and lots of blockchains that are doing really nothing that have very low fees, right? So I can think about things that are very relevant for users, like how much does it cost me to do this and how long does it take for it to get done, that nonetheless are in some sense not like sufficiently deep for a researcher to say, okay, this is indicative of progress.
Yeah, that's a good point. I would say like capacity is important. So like in some sense, like from the perspective of the engineer, there is nothing that our networking engineer can do to bring net new users to the protocol other than make the protocol better. So like there's like a kind of orthogonal thing where it's like, make this thing, open up the capacity so that it's never an issue that an app has too much load for the chain. So capacity, I think, is really important in terms of both how many transactions we can process and then sort of some version of what the complexity of those transactions is, although that's quite hard to define. Like, for example, the conversion between what we have our CUs and Ethereum gas is quite hairy, and people have tried to do it. I think it's kind of pointless to do, but like that's kind of one thing, which is make sure that we have as much capacity as we can. So that's called like increased bandwidth. And then there's like, what's the kind of end to end user latency? That's, I think, a really important metric. Another one, which is more involved, but I think is super important, is the censorship resistance of the protocol on various time horizons. And we're not super concerned about like state actor resistance or like whatever these other prepper World War III resistance. These are like all prepper things that the Ethereum people care a lot about. We don't care about them. We do care about censorship resistance on a short time scale, in that it has direct economic implications on what kind of protocols you can build on the system. And so, I have a formal definition of what that looks like. It's kind of a function of how much you pay and how much the adversary has to pay to censor you. And it's kind of relevant to the time scale. I think that's a really important metric. The length of the leader window is important, because that's the leader monopoly, and the leader monopoly is not good for decentralized NASDAQ, which is what we're trying to do. But yeah, those are the big three, I would say. We have obviously increased bandwidth, reduced latency, and then this third thing, which is, can you like reasonably run financial applications that actually work on the chain? And so that's like the third thing, and that's like a lot of what I focus on. And sometimes those things are in tension, and you have to decide what the trade-off is.
So could you, just for the sake of concreteness, clarify what is the current bandwidth and latency of Solana? How does that compare to Ethereum, and how have those two metrics evolved over the last few years for Solana?
Yeah, so right now Ethereum's doing about 20 TPS on mainnet, and we're doing about 1,000 TPS on mainnet. So we're like 50x more transactions than them right now on mainnet. If you include all the L2s, I think they have about 200 TPS. Um, I think our total throughput in terms of megabytes is about 7 megabytes per second. And I believe that Ethereum, including the blob data, is only about 1 megabyte per second, even with the
Okay, but
latest
if I can
increase.
ask, like, part of the, part of the reason throughput may be at something, it could be due to uh, the cost being so high that, meaning the user cost, right? Like there's fees that are paid to use the chain, and so it's possible the system can tolerate, and probable that the system can tolerate higher throughput, but you don't see it because of the sort of the fee
Right.
structure. Um, uh, so I guess what I'm saying is, like, what is the max throughput you would say of like Solana and Ethereum at this point in time? Because that essentially
So,
takes out that demand piece, right?
yeah, so if you do like a really simple transfer on Solana, I think we can
Yeah.
do about 65,000 TPS right now. Um,
Okay.
and we did a kind of test on mainnet. KV, who's a super smart guy who, did a physics PhD at Stanford, and now he does some trading on chain. He's did an experiment where he like ran as much as he could through his validator and on mainnet. So this was not on testnet. This was on mainnet, and he did
Hmm.
100,000 TPS, and it took a little bit too long for the shreds to disseminate. So if you kind of handicap as more like 65K that we could actually do, and things would get there in the amount of time that they're supposed to get there. So yeah, I think 65K is kind of where we're at in terms of simple transfers. That's great. That's what Visa does. That's kind of good. But then obviously the more complicated you do, the more data you want to load. Um, that's kind of gonna be more complicated as you add more variables there. And then Ethereum, like I think if you do a bunch, I don't know what the theoretical max TPS of Ethereum is. What's the I forgot the min. Oh, it's 20K min for like min gas on Ethereum for any transaction. And so you have what's that? What's the like block size right now? What's the gas limit? 60 mil?
Uh,
60 mega
well,
gas?
so first of all, do you mean the target block size or the actual, like? Because of course they're targeting half fill blocks, right?
Yeah.
What I guess you mean, I guess the question, it was my question, so I guess what do I mean? Uh,
Yeah.
um, let's see.
Something like
So
30
the
mil
gas limit's
divided by
45. It's 45 million. Looks like the gas limit
45
right
mil
now.
right now. Oh, I thought they were going to
Yeah.
60. Anyway, okay, so it's 45 mil gas limit, and then the target is half of that. Okay, so 45 mil divided by 20K is theoretical max Ethereum TPS defined by the protocol.
But I mean, you can
I
set the gas limit to be something insanely high. That doesn't mean you could actually like reliably get the block full without causing problems in the
Yeah,
network, right?
I don't know
So
what
you're basically
is
saying,
going on
presuming this
upstream.
this this max is actually something that they can tolerate, we can basically do arithmetic to reverse engineer the TPS by taking the gas for the simplest transaction and dividing it, basically dividing the max block size by that, or
Yeah.
max block size divided by the gas for the transaction. But okay.
But
Um,
you're not putting blobs in that for the L2s, right? You're not counting the
Uh,
L2
well,
transactions.
you like can't. You have to execute to. In my definition, you have to execute to be. Uh, yeah, I just don't really count blobs at all. But
and, and
even if
and
you
so
include the blobs, like they push less megabytes through than we do on Solana, like by a factor of 7 or something.
and what about the latency difference?
Ethereum, so slot time is 12 seconds.
Yeah.
Time to finality is, I think, 2 epochs. So it's like the next epoch has to finish. So in expectation, you're maybe like 16 slots and then another 32 slots after that for finality. So you kind of get a soft confirmation after,
But so actually,
say,
if I can interject there, so like because you described the current protocol Solana has as similar to Ghost, and Ghost doesn't have sort of finality, like deterministic finality, which was kind of the point of Casper and therefore Gasper. So what are we actually? I actually get very confused a lot of times when people compare latencies across chains for this reason. Like is the latency in Bitcoin infinity? Uh, I mean, like what is probabilistic finality? Like, how do you compare probabilistic finality to deterministic finality? Because it sounds like you were doing the calculation for the finality gadget a moment ago for Ethereum.
Yeah, well, we like on Solana, if you get to a tower height of 32 slots, which is the
Uh-huh.
same as the Ethereum epoch length,
Yeah.
but that's just a coincidence, then I think it takes like a billion years for the lockouts to happen such that you could reverse the finality at that height. So, like, technically, like, it's not safe, but if this thing were to be reversed, it would take a billion years for the honest nodes to reset their lockout. So it's something like that. I think like 32 slots is reasonably final on Solana,
Mm.
with the way tower is specified, and on ETH, like you have like a finality of that's at the epoch time.
And under Alpenglow, is that like single slot finality or?
It will be sub slot actually because the votes will be going out. You won't be waiting for the protocol to go for slots to come. You just send out the block, send out the votes, send out the confirmations. And so it actually happens in, after you've received the block, between the time that you receive the block and you have confirmation, it's like 150 milliseconds. If you add on a time of sending the block out, it's about 300 milliseconds because it's, 150 milliseconds for rotor. And then maybe you have another expected wait time, which is the time between when you sent your transaction in and the consensus round started. That's maybe say 200 milliseconds, which is half of 400 milliseconds. So around 500 milliseconds when Alpenglow comes out would be your kind of expected time to finality after hitting the leader. And maybe you need some time to hit the leader too. So maybe it's like 600 milliseconds.
Okay,
Sorry,
let's
I did a bunch of
yeah.
diagrams for this, so I have like way too much detail of like what the actual flow is from send to finality on all three
No,
of these
that's great.
chains.
I think like breaking it down there is actually very useful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so going. There was one thing you wanted to touch on, Max, that I think we should go back to. So we kind of rewind to go back to execution, but you also said account structure. So
Yeah,
I think
let me talk a little bit about account structure. So
Okay.
the philosophy of Solana was there's only like 6 things that you want to do on a blockchain. Like basically token creation, trading tokens, lending tokens, NFTs, and a few others that I forgot about. And so the design was like, hey, let's make sure that tokens are really, really front and center to what the blockchain is designed for. On Ethereum, a token like an ERC20 token stores your balances in a mapping. And so the contract address has a bunch of data in it. One of the things it has is like this hash map where you put in your public key and it tells you how many tokens you have in that contract. And on Solana, that's flipped around. So instead of a mapping inside the contract from your public key to how many tokens you have, it kind of lives with your account. And so if you're MetaMask and you're trying to figure out how many tokens does Brad have, I actually have to go and scan every single contract that has a token to see the mapping and then check it to see if your token is in there. Whereas on Solana, you have these token accounts which are kind of associated with your normal account, which contains your Solana balance. And so if I want to know which tokens you own, I look at Brad's normal account, which is associated with your public key, and then immediately it's associated with all the tokens you own because there's a token account there. So it's like definitely much faster and more like at least this is one of like the things where it's like, oh wait, you can just design things a better way. Like you can just do things. Like you don't have to like be the EVM because there's no way that they got all this stuff right on day one. and I'm sure there's things that we do wrong that are way better in Move as well. But there's some balance between network effect and building the thing the right way.
Is there some
But
kind of trade-off there about like writing smart contracts, or uh, it seems like something is more rigid in the thing you described, and I can't really pin it down. Oh, is
I
it?
think the biggest
Yeah.
trade-off is that it's uh, every token balance is its own account, and so it takes up more room in the state. But I don't think that is a super big trade-off. I think it's much better for parallel execution. So if we were to kind of take the EVM structure and then try to map on our program structure, so every transaction on Solana is associated with an access list, and the access list has two parts: which accounts do you want to read and which accounts do you want to write. And this allows us to kind of schedule transactions at the same time as long as they don't touch the same state in a conflicting way. Because obviously you can't write two things at the same time, otherwise that's not thread safe. And so if you try to naively take the Ethereum token model, where the mapping lives inside the program account, and map it into Solana world, then every time you try to transfer USDC, you need to lock the right lock on the Ethereum account, or sorry, on the USDC account, because that's where the mapping is. And we are able to get around that because we have this account model that's allows the parallelization to work.
so just something concrete to help me understand this through. So current, like in the Ethereum model, you could write functions in a token contract that, for instance, conditioned on information in that mapping, even for users that aren't the ones that are having their state affected, let's say. Like, for instance, I say that the transfer function works for me only if Brad has 5 tokens. I don't know why that makes sense, but whatever. You could do that because, in some sense, the data is stored in that same code body, that smart contract. It's an attribute of the computer of the smart contract that is executing. If I understood you correctly, you said that in this case the mapping sort of isn't, the hash map isn't there in the smart contract. The data is actually stored at the equivalent of like the externally owned account in the Ethereum speak. And so I'm wondering, is there any kind of like limitation in terms of the smart contracts code now accessing that state and conditioning on that state and so on?
Yeah, you can only read what you requested to read. So
Okay.
if I, for example, wanted to say, I want to transfer 10 USDC to Fahad only if Brad has at least 5 USDC. Now in my access list, I have to say, I need to access in a read only manner Brad's token account.
Sure.
And
But
then
but
I
I'm
want to
saying
verify
where is that contract logic written? So I'm saying can that contract logic be written in the equivalent of a Solana smart contract, or is that written now separately? Because basically what I'm saying is, like, if I write a bunch of code and I define a variable which is called balances, then if I refer to balances, it's well defined because it's in the same code body. Whereas here it sounds like you're saying there is no balances variable. It's something associated with the state of another account. I guess you can reference that account as just as a different, like as you would, for instance, like an internal a reference from one smart contract to another, for instance, in Ethereum. Um,
Yeah, so our version in Ethereum is called delegate call, and we have CPI, which is kind of similar idea where you can kind of call into another program if you want to. But yeah, I mean, you can read the data from other accounts
yeah.
in a program as long as your transaction has said that you wanted to read that data, and if it didn't, then you're gonna fail.
Right. So in some sense, for instance, when I think about internal transactions in Ethereum, your access list has to subsume all of that. Like if I'm thinking about, having a call that then accesses the state of another smart contract, et cetera, all of them have to show up in my access list on the read side.
Yep.
Okay.
Or on the right side if you want to rate it.
Well, yeah. So depending on whether I'm actually writing
Yeah.
to the states of those things. Um, can you also sort of walk us through just sort of the something like a token deployment? Because my understanding was this also is a bit different than the Ethereum context. Because obviously, so one thing in the background here, standardization is very useful and important for front ends. You mentioned MetaMask a couple of times, like for instance, for them. And in the Ethereum context, essentially, we just, of course, deploy brand new smart contracts that have the interface for ERC20 or whatever in there. But my understanding is Solana does this a bit differently, right?
Yeah, so there's a token program, and any token is like owned by the token program, and that's I think like there's some standard smart contract that's like the ERC20 reference implementation, and if you implement those interfaces on ETH, then that's like then you're like an ERC20 token.
Mm-hmm.
And on Solana, it's like you want to be this type of token, you like just create a new account for that token, and it's owned by the token program.
Right. So could you clarify, because you used the word program and you used the word account, but I think it's clear, or I think when you use the word account, you're not using it in the context of like externally owned account there. So it seems like there's one other piece than the Ethereum ecosystem, at least. Like, because Ethereum externally owned account, smart contract. That's basic. That's the types of accounts we have. In this case, there's a program. So could you just this is partially also just jargon.
Yeah, there's a bunch of different account types. There's like a normal account. This account is what stores your Solana balance. It has a land ports field, which is how much Solana you have, and it can own a bunch of stuff. And it's owned by the system program, which is like the main program that owns.
Is every account owned by some program?
Yeah, except the system program, which is the system program. So yeah, you can kind of draw a tree. This is also like the area that I'm least familiar with in the Solana protocol and the Ethereum protocol. So I may get things wrong and people might yell at me, but that's okay. Wouldn't be the first time people have yelled at me. But anyway, like you have a bunch of different account types. You have like system accounts, which are fee-paying accounts, nonce accounts, which are also similar to a normal account, which are fee-paying accounts. And then you have like programs. You have kind of data accounts, which just store data. You have token accounts, which are tokens.
So token accounts are a type of account?
Yeah.
Like a special kind?
We have about 630 million token accounts, and 330 million of those are zero balance. So we want to get rid of them. And it's like 45 gigabytes of our 440 gigabyte state is like these token accounts with zero balance.
So how many account types do you have total?
That's I don't know. I think it's like 8 or 9, and maybe like some more special ones that are super rare after that.
Who has the ability to increase the amount of token accounts? Like, so part of what is like, sorry, not token accounts. I meant the type of accounts, because you mentioned the token program, and so I'm kind of wondering. So are tokens then, I guess this relates to what you're saying earlier, like are tokens somehow special under Solana, and that's why, for instance, there is a token program and there are then token accounts? Or is it something like anybody can create a program and then there can be an account type associated with that program or something like that?
Like, is it token program protocol level?
Well, like you can make like sub accounts that are like owned by a program too.
But who can make programs?
Anybody can deploy a program. Just
okay. So
who made the token program
account? Well, there's one canonical token program. You could make a new token protocol if you want to, and if people want to use it, then they can inherit from it. But the nice thing about having everybody reference one single token program is that when we come up with a better way to do it, then with the consent of governance, of course, we can swap it out. And then everybody has cheaper token transfers. And so that's like one of the things that we're working on right now with P-Token.
But so then when you said like whatever 8 or 9 account types, so if Brad here deploys a token prime program because he wants to compete with this token program thing, does that mean that now there's a whatever 9th or 10th type of account, because any account can be created that is owned by his token prime program?
Okay, like let me say again that I have no idea what I'm talking about here, but I'm pretty sure that the canonical token program is owned by the system program. And
Okay.
so if you were to
Okay.
make a new token program, it would be owned by your um, it would be like owned by you, who is the deployer. So it would
Oh, so this
not.
goes back to your tree thing. Like you, when you say
Yeah,
you, your account is owned by the system program.
yeah. But I think the canonical token program is owned by the system program. But I don't
Okay,
know.
so
I'd have to verify that.
there's something special about programs that are owned by the system program, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it's not. I mean, it's just a convention, right? Like, you could make a new token type, like immutable program if you wanted to, and if everybody thinks it's better, like you could get people to switch over. But the
Okay.
USDC implementation is the token is like
I guess the part that's tripping me up is your usage of the word owned. So basically, like, so if we were talking about implementation of interfaces, like inheritance, I get that,
yeah
right? So it's like, okay, I create a program and you can inherit from the program, and so like essentially, I'm just defining sort of some structure, and people can essentially inherit that structure. That makes I get that, but so I guess does the word owned as you are using it have some technical meaning?
um
Or
it
do you
is
mean
like
inheritance, or do you mean uh,
it's not exactly inheritance. It's kind of like it's like a file structure almost. Like
okay?
you have like the root directory, which is a system program, and then you have like things
But
that
part of it is
are
like what defines the content of these account types that happen to be owned by a particular program, right? So like the nice thing about inheritance is like it now defines the content, it defines the type of thing we're talking about. Whereas if I have a file directory system, like I have a folder, I can put like random crap in the folder, right? Like there's like me telling you that it's in this subdirectory doesn't like restrain anything about like the extension of the file or anything about it, right? Whereas obviously inheritance would just by construction do that. And so what I'm trying to understand here is that is there the ability of anybody essentially to create uh, sort of their own structure for something that would be recognized as an account, meaning that it's like an identity in the system that can trigger transactions and so on and so on. The way, for instance, in EOA, I guess a smart contract can't trigger transactions in Ethereum, so maybe that's a bad example. But it can do an internal transaction, so maybe it's not that bad of an example. But yeah, so I'm just trying to. I guess what I'm saying is I'm confused, and if you can help, that would be good.
yeah. I mean the the program kind of specifies which types of things can be in its directory. Like for example, the token program, there are like tokens that can be there, and then the tokens can have like token accounts, which are like pointing to them as the mint. So um, partly like I don't have as clear a view of this as I do of the rest of the Solana protocol because, well, first of all, I didn't have a super clear view of how the EVM worked, and now I'm switching 3 years of EVM to SVM, and I spend most of my time working on consensus stuff. So I don't look at this stuff that closely, but I think it's somewhere in between inheritance and ownership, and that's the way I would think about it.
So maybe just one last question on that. So let's stick with this idea of tokens and the point you made earlier about the data associated with what in the Ethereum world we would think of balances for users being stored at the user account rather than the token account. Um, so in the Ethereum context, and like it's pretty clear what's going on because, as you said, it's just a hash map that is in the token account or the token smart contract itself. And so when we change somebody's balances, we're literally just writing over the sort of value in the hash map associated with the key, which is the user, the EOA address. Here, if there's no hash map in the token account itself, what even is the sort of binding tie between the user account and the token account, uh, uh, meaning, yeah, like, could you give some sense of, so let's say I transfer a unit of whatever token to Brad. Um, I'm, so I guess there would be a reading of my account itself in there, and it would actually be writing because it would be decrementing mine, and a reading and writing of Brad's account. What, like, where does the token account actually show up then in some sense? Like,
So
is it being
if
read to?
Brad
Is it being
already has a token account, then
no?
it
So
will
he's
like
a regular user account, right? And I'm a regular user account.
yeah.
And I want to send him 1 unit of this token that I hold. So there's a token account for it. And so presumably, so if I understood correctly, the data that says I own 1 unit is stored in my user account, not in the token account, right?
It's stored in the token account, which is associated with my user account.
Token account. Let's see.
So
So
there,
what does the word associated mean there?
so like I have a account which contains my Sol balance, and
Mhm.
then it kind of owns a bunch of stuff, some of which are token accounts which contain my balances of USDC and a bunch of other stuff.
Uh, so do I own a different token account for every token
Yes.
that
Yes.
so when does the token account so let's say I just acquired USDC for the very first time. Does that then mean that there's now a new token account that is created that I own?
Yeah. And you have to pay some rent for that too, because you're making an
Okay.
account.
Okay.
Okay, Max, let me save you from Fahad's further questions.
Fahad is trying to get me in trouble with the
Yeah.
young people. I'm gonna get in trouble after this.
Yeah.
I might have to send this for fact checking so that I don't get roasted on Twitter.
Okay, I have like I want to go back to something. I like the basic questions. Something you brought up when you talked about how good a protocol is if the user doesn't have to think about the infrastructure. And you were saying, I mean, you're making true statements about Ethereum where you have to think about who, like, am I using a, what do you call it, like Mev share, and like, am I going to get sandwich, and all these, how do I protect myself from these things? It's very, very annoying. But I guess, your claim, by bringing up that argument, the assumption is that you don't have to do that on Solana. And so maybe you can talk about that. But one thing I'm curious for your overall take on with that statement is that I have the impression that people are building apps for consumers on Solana and not on Ethereum or any layer 2, like Helium Mobile. I use Helium. It does something with Solana. I don't know, like I use some, like, I'm not going to say all the things I use and advertise, but I use some other things, and somehow they use Solana, and I'm like, what's going on? Right? Why is none of the things I use Ethereum? I'm just curious what your take on that is.
Partly it's a snowball, like it's a flywheel, right? When you see, so we have, I think, 6 unicorns that are all kind of recently minted unicorns on Solana. So Jito, Pump.Fun, Bonk was up there for a while. What are the other ones? Jupiter, these kinds of things. Like, just like so many huge success cases that are not just a big token, but actually have real revenue. And when you start to see that in an ecosystem, other people also want that as outcomes. And so they start building, and it kind of builds from there. But like, how did we get those apps in the first place is another question. And I think if you're building for real users and that's what you care about, then 20 TPS or 12 TPS, which is what Ethereum was able to do at the time, just obviously not going to work. Like, you just know deep in your bones that the goal of your product is much more ambitious than 12 TPS. Like, you want everybody using this thing, and there's no Pump.Fun on 12 TPS. So that's, I think, one thing, which is like, it's incompatible with building Helium Mobile, which has millions of monthly active users, when like millions of monthly active users would like destroy the chain because it just
But
wouldn't have enough
you could
capacity.
do this on layer twos, right?
Yeah, but I think like the layer twos are so fragmented, right? There's something about having everybody on one chain where all the users are that is just a much better experience for acquiring users. The users are already there. You don't have to bridge them over to your layer two. Um, you don't have to convince them why your chain is better because they're already on the chain. You're not basically worried about that. And then I think the onboarding experience, which is not the core protocol has not really done very much on this. Although Anza we did release some passkey stuff recently, which is super cool. But we haven't done a lot to make the onboarding experience better. It's been a lot of like the moon shots and the moon pays and just phantom, and they just built a much better onboarding experience, and that has helped a lot of users come onto the chain that otherwise wouldn't be here. So
You're saying Solana built a better onboarding experience?
I'm saying Solana
Yeah.
apps built a better
Solana
onboarding
apps,
experience.
okay.
I
Yeah.
think like Solana is somehow attractive to a different type of founder who is
Hmm.
interested not necessarily in the ideology of blockchain and crypto, but rather in building an app that works. And so, but I mean, there's still a lot of people building on other chains too. It's just like when you talk to a founder, the hardest part is distribution. It's not tech. It's not uh, designing the thing. It's really distribution. And when you start on Solana, you have a head start there because there's already a bunch of users who are really low friction, and they'll start using their product if it's good enough.
Okay. Um, yeah, and I think this is a great point to transition to maybe our final question is why did you move from Ethereum, 3 years on Ethereum, and switch to Solana?
Yeah, I think the biggest reason for me was I wanted to talk about technical problems and spend my day solving technical problems and not solving social layer problems. And so, like, to some extent that's been successful, to some extent not so successful, but I definitely spend a lot more of my time, like, actually at the blackboard writing out math or actually reading the code and making plots or like I just spend way more of my time doing that now in Solana than I used to do in Ethereum because the problems with Ethereum were not uh like any low hanging fruit on Solana has already kind of been done. Like, oh, like the snapshots are too large. Maybe we should compress them. Somebody already did that. On Ethereum, like they're still arguing about that 5 years later on the core dev call, even though it's like so obvious to do. So this kind of stuff is like I don't know. I wanted to spend a lot of my time like solving technical problems. I wanted to be in an ecosystem where everybody had a shared vision of like blockchains are for, or like they want to build a blockchain that's like going to compete with Nasdaq. So that was really nice too. It's like that was always my vision of what Ethereum should be, and it wasn't everybody's vision. And so when I'm like, hey, we need to do this multi-leader thing because the current system doesn't work for Nasdaq, and you would get this like, well, we're not trying to be Nasdaq, so like we're not trying to be an exchange. We don't want to trade securities. We don't want to do this. Okay, we want to be the infinite garden, and we don't want to focus on anything to do it well enough to actually win at anything. So that was kind of my thing. It was like a lot of like like Ethereum for me is always going to be the place that I started out. It's like I know it really deeply, and it's like I think about the Solana protocol in a lot of parallels with what I know about Ethereum. But the problem for me was like, even if you are like God's son embodied, you cannot do anything on this protocol because there's just no way. There's just no feasible path, no matter how charismatic, no matter how smart, no matter how good the idea is, just like takes way too long to get in. And I think Dankrad has kind of played every card exactly right. He's super soft spoken. He has a great relationship with everybody in Ethereum, and it took him like 5 years to land dank sharding, which was just like such an obvious feature that you should be doing if you're and it's not landed yet. Like it's not in the protocol yet. Like it's finally coming in the next hard fork, which is who knows how many years and a half away, right? Like this thing that he has been working on, and he started 5 years before me. So I had another 5 years of ossification. I had one big feature that I wanted to land, and I'm looking at the timeline to land it, and I'm like, this is just not the way I want to spend the next 5 years of my life. And so I was like, if I'm going to spend that time, I should do it on a chain that actually wants that feature. And so the thing I'm convincing them of is, this is important for your end goal, and this is how you should do it, rather than your end goal should be to compete with NASDAQ. At least that first step was already done for me.
With
What was the
Solana.
feature?
Multi-leader.
Okay.
And you're saying with Solana, you don't have to worry about the alignment because they already know what they want to do, whereas Ethereum is very like infinite garden.
I mean, it's not like I don't have to worry about the alignment at all, but at least I
Okay.
have, Tolly is like 100% all in on multi-leader, so I don't have to worry about whether Vitalik is like 100% all in on this thing or not. I don't have to worry about that, at least. I definitely still, it's not like you can just say like, hey, this is this thing that we should do. IBRL doesn't matter anymore. Let's do this. And like everybody's going to be 100% on board right away. We're working through it, obviously, but at least the step one of, hey, we are building decentralized NASDAQ is done. And then I feel really confident about laying out the follow-on for why censorship resistance, short-term censorship resistance is super important to achieve that. But if you don't have the first brick, I think that's the most difficult one to convince everybody of. So that was always my thought process.
Okay. As promised, that was the last question. So yeah, thanks again so much, Max. It's been super informative. Sorry that Fahad, got you with those technical questions, but I think it was still
Thank you
useful.
for your patience.
Yeah.
We academics very much appreciate being clued in.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I answered everything correctly, but the account model is probably the part of the protocol I understand the least well. So like anything in the VM is quite cloudy for me. Luckily, I've been looking a little bit at it recently for our state rent stuff, so I knew a little bit about it. But yeah,
Cool. Okay. Thank you, Max.
yeah, this is fun. We didn't even talk about